stay true to what you wanted to found the show in the first place. Take the time and the patience to build a listener base, to connect with people that are listening to your show. I mean, they're tuning in to hear what you have to say. You're in their head speaking to them whenever they're listening to an episode. And there's responsibility that comes with that.
Welcome to the Strategic Momentum Podcast, the show where we share tips, stories, and advice from progressive leaders on what it takes to break through that business inertia and propel you and your business forward. I'm your host, Connie Steele. Back in episode 44, we explored the entrepreneurial journey of the three founding members of Crate Media, the production company and media agency behind the Strategic Momentum Podcast. The trio shared the challenges they faced growing a remote startup, the lessons they learned, and the passion for podcasting that keeps them going. These young entrepreneurs are Cody Boyce, Hayden Lee, and Ben Gregson. If you haven't listened already, I highly recommend going back to episode 44 first. Today, the team returns to provide their take on the podcasting space, from what it takes to create a successful podcast to the common challenges and misconceptions that cause many to get stuck. Because from their own experiences, they've come to learn how to master the technical and the strategic elements of their industry, navigate a still nascent medium while driving momentum for their clients and their own business. We'll start with a reminder of why podcasting attracted them personally in the first place with Hayden.
And so for me, it really is a place where it's a lot of, especially the podcasts I listen to, a lot of them are completely unfiltered, the immediate thought, and it's personal, but it's public all at the same time. Do you know? And so it's people's thoughts, it's people's beliefs, it's people's attitudes, it's people's pasts, people's histories, people's rises to fame. Is that the way you would say that? It's everything, and it's all out there, and you can listen to it all day long. It's just fantastic.
So it's almost like the authenticity of the platform, that you can really share whatever, whenever, however.
That's such a succinct way to say it. Yeah.
Well, the one thing I've found with podcasts is that, and you also were the ones who've said that from the beginning, you do it because you love it, but you do it because it has, there's a purpose that you specifically have. And the intent is to help people in some way versus probably some of the other mediums where they're advertising driven. It's not really necessary to help others and with any somewhat, I guess, altruistic intent. Many other platforms is just for a business intent, just to make money. But, with podcasting and what I've pieced together too from what you've said, it's the authenticity of it, the ability to really connect with people on a level that other mediums haven't given you, also helps you feel fulfilled in being able to grow this channel or this medium for the people that you serve.
And do you know what it is? Everyone has a story. Everyone has a story, whether it's their past, whether it's their career, whether it's something they're going through. Everyone has a story. And whether they admit it or not, everyone would like their story told. Everyone's dreamt of bringing out the book or who would play them in the movie. Everyone wants their story told, man. When I came back from India, that's all I wanted to do. Tell my stories. I wanted to tell people my stories, tell them how it was. And what we do, and the reason I enjoy it, what we do is we help people tell their stories, because it's nice having these stories. And yeah, you can open the window and yell to someone on the street, and that's telling your story, true. But isn't it better telling your story to the amount of people that you want to and the way that you want to, and everything is crafted the way that you want to? This is what we enjoy. It's crafting the things that help people tell their stories. This is why I enjoy it.
For Hayden and the others, podcasting presents an opportunity to connect with an audience on a more authentic and personal level. There is an intimacy, a vulnerability to the unfiltered stories told in podcasts, and it results in an entirely unique listening experience and connection to the creators that you don't necessarily find in other media.
What I'm about to say is the same thing that I try to tell hosts when they want to start a show, and what can set them apart, or what's the real draw of podcasting, is that I get to feel like I'm sitting down listening to these two awesome people have a conversation right next to me. And the intimacy of podcasting, I think, because everybody's, wearing their earbuds and basically these people are inside your head. So what I loved about it was like, it wasn't like a quick 4-minute soundbite on the news about something. It wasn't a quick 10-minute YouTube video. I got to sit here and have these people talk to me for 3 hours or 4 hours about, whatever they wanted. And sometimes it would be hilarious, just ridiculous inside jokes and stuff. And sometimes it would be like actionable business advice or motivational advice, things like that. It just, I don't know. There's really nothing that's as intimate as listening to podcasts.
And for Ben Gregson, the writer, podcasting is simply a huge part of his life.
I got into podcasts fairly early on, and I'd say over the course of high school and college, it slowly sort of became my dominant media, entertainment media that I consumed just generally. It was, for I think a lot of the reasons, a lot of people like podcasts. It's easy to do passively. They're free, and you can, you feel sort of a different kind of connection to the host than you do if you're like watching a television show or something along those lines. And to the point that it just, at this point, is a pretty dramatically dominant amount of my, just the content I consume on a daily basis.
How many hours do you think you spend listening to podcasts?
Just daily. If you count while I'm falling asleep, I would guess, 4 to 6 hours.
That's a lot. Wow.
As early adopters of podcasts, the team has seen the industry change quite a bit. The ease of accessibility and development has created an explosion from both a listenership and creation perspective.
Yeah, it's gotten significantly more segmented, I guess. I mean, the sort of the actual, it was a little more, I don't know the right word, weird. I guess at the beginning, there wasn't that much of a direction a lot of them were going in. They were just kind of like a radio show or a TV show in another place, more so than I feel like its own thing. And I feel like over time, I guess not over time, more when the iPhone came out and they were more immediately accessible. It didn't have the work you had to go through to actually get it. It didn't feel quite as much of a club or a walled garden. And it got a lot more open. Because democratized is the word that a lot of people in the industry like to use. And since then, I feel like it's gotten much more segmented and niched down in pretty much every possible area. But also, it's just the lowering the barriers to actually creating a podcast, both just technology getting cheaper and the knowledge being more available, has significantly changed the variety of hosts and the variety of shows and the sheer number of shows out there.
So in general, because of the lower barriers to entry and the accessibility of being able to tap into them, you've certainly see a greater explosion in offerings now, such that I think it covers just about everything. Probably any topic that you have in mind, there's probably a podcast on it.
Yeah, I can't imagine there's anything with no one talking about it. But I think there is some about anything you could possibly be interested in.
Well, podcasting comes from a very indie mindset. It was very niche when it started. It was very niche up until a couple years ago when, people think that one big inflection point with podcasting was when Serial was released because it was such a huge show. But what really was going on there behind the scenes is that the podcast app was on the iPhone. When you got your iPhone and you fired it up right next to iTunes, the podcast app was there. So the huge shift there was really that it was more accessible. It was in front of everybody's faces, and it really peaked then. So it's been blowing up exceptionally in the past couple of years, but it does have very indie roots, very do-it-yourself roots. And what we've tried to do, especially since that's kind of how we started this whole thing, is really keep those tenets and keep the independent and keep the conversational type of podcasts. We try to internalize that as we're working on shows.
There is an element of freedom and independence with podcasting. It's this ability to express oneself in a more flexible and expansive way than some other mediums. And that is also a core driver of what fuels this team to do what they do for their clients and themselves.
If you're going on a radio interview, right? Say you're a guest and you're going on a radio interview, right? And you're going on a podcast. I think the podcast is, as an analogy, the podcast is more of an entrepreneurial endeavor. It's you alone. If you're hosting a podcast, it's your thing. You're not joining a company and doing as the company says and having a job. You're doing your own thing. And because it's your own thing, it can be however you want it to be. You know, I just think it really is, in a lot of ways, the same as entrepreneurialism. That's a long word. It really is the same of that. It really is the same as that because it's your thing. You grow it how you want. You can do what you want with it. And this all ties back into that feeling of freedom that I think a lot of people are craving nowadays.
So what is it like working with so many startup podcasts for you?
Man, I love it. I really do. Because in what other state would you like to see people than when they're showing their vulnerability? For me, that's the perfect way in which to view someone. And when someone's putting their thoughts out there into the world, perhaps unfiltered, and they're worried, are people going to like this? Is anyone actually going to listen? They're worried about this. They're vulnerable. Is there any better way that people can be? I absolutely love that. That's the most genuine that people can be. That's the most genuine time in our lives, right? And so for me, I love that. And I love helping people to build that, whatever they want to build, allowing them to make that come to fruition. It's rewarding. And that was another thing on my list of, well, let's say demands for a job, to have an overall net positive on at least one person's life. If someone comes in and we help them build a podcast and then it goes on to other things or anything like that, it feels good because it feels like we're doing good because we're helping someone. Is there anything better? And it's location independent. Is there anything better?
Cody, Ben, and Hayden's individual passions for storytelling are evident, and collectively, they're able to combine resources to help other people tell their stories in impactful ways. But not everyone gets into podcasting for the same reasons. So I asked Crate Media, what are the common misconceptions that many aspiring podcast creators believe when they enter the space?
I think it's similar to many other creative outlets. It's let's say starting a band. People start a band because it's fun to start a band, right? It's the same as podcasts. It's fun to start a podcast. But there are some people that start a band and saying, we want to be the next Queen or whoever, right? And some of the common misconceptions are, as long as we work hard, as long as we do this and we work hard and we do everything we can, we're going to make it. And the other common misconception that goes into that is that making it equals success. Making it only, and well, the other one is then what is making it? But making it only equals success if that was your goal in the first place. It goes back to what I was saying about finding your why. If your why is making it, first we have to decide what making it actually entails. If it's financial, then it depends on what your why is, And that really is one of the big misconceptions, that it is easy. I mean, people think, I'll get my phone out, I'll start recording on there, and then I'll upload it to iTunes. Okay, firstly, upload, we don't use that word. iTunes, it's not even called, never mind. And so, it really is not as easy as people think, which I suppose is a good thing because it's a little bit of a barrier to entry. I'm a little bit of a fan of a good old barrier to entry, which is kind of nice. And so, it being easy is definitely a misconception. And I have also heard I should start a podcast because I have a podcast voice thing. I've heard, I know some cool people, so I'll interview them. Everyone wants to interview people that they know. And then, there are many reasons that people do want to start a podcast, but it goes to your why again. Everything goes back to that. But for me, it's, what is your goal? What's your goal? If you want to start a podcast because you have a great podcast voice, what's the end goal there? Why are you doing it? Do you enjoy having a podcast voice? Is that something that you want to do in your spare time? What's the reason? It all comes back to your why, man. I've always said this. It always comes back to your why.
And Ben shares his point of view on the challenges that commonly get podcast creators stuck.
I say that The biggest challenge, I think, is that it's never, no one ever quite expects it to be the amount of time it is. Either the small parts of organizing like guests and getting them and then booking them and then actually talking to them and then doing everything after it. And everything after it, it's why people usually come to us, because they don't want to do the everything after it part. And that it is just, it seems, because everyone can do it, that it seems like it is going to be easy. And then maybe it is not quite as easy as people expect. And then I guess second is just continuing to do it once they realize it's hard. I think the number of podcasts that exist and the number of podcasts that like only have like 10 episodes is are kind of staggering.
What is that percentage? I am curious. What is that percentage?
I have a slide that Rob Walsh has shared at numerous conferences, but I do not have it memorized. It's a thing that gets called pod fading. But and we've seen it, although actually I have not compared it, but I would say relatively few of our clients have just entirely stopped. But you see people who come in, they sort of want to rush to launch, and then they sort of launched, and then within like 5 episodes, they're behind and they're not sort of keeping up, and then they just kind of disappear. And I think that's probably a lot of podcasts, although probably just as much that are people talking to each other saying, man, it would be really cool to start a podcast that never happened.
With the perception that building a successful podcast is easy, many don't think to put a strategy behind it. But like any other business venture, you need to start out with a plan, a clear purpose for being, and a vision for where you want to go. For many, however, monetization tends to be a key driver for their why. But as Cody and Ben will tell us, focusing on creating revenue and expecting it to happen quickly comes with its own problems. At the end of the day, creating genuine experiences for your audience, building those relationships with your potential listeners should come first.
It is not that hard to start a podcast. It is much harder to get people to listen to a podcast. And I would generally never recommend someone to start a podcast if the reason is they want to create a source of revenue. I think you can ultimately segue a podcast into increased revenue or increased authority, or you and as a bigger part of the mind share in a space. And you can directly make money off a podcast. It's just a pretty significantly small number of them, especially if you're thinking I'm going to make money off of ads.
I think that's the biggest one, that we have to not convince people that they can't do that, because I never want to convince someone that they can't make a successful show or monetize their show. But just coming to terms with the reality of podcasting, the reality of how advertising works in podcasting, that the goal of a show should not be to put it up and monetize it and make profit from it as soon as possible, because that goes against the indie DIY roots of the industry itself.
So what is your recommendation in terms of what the goal of the show needs to be at the outset?
Stay true to what you wanted to found the show in the first place. Take the time and the patience to build a listener base, to connect with people that are listening to your show. I mean, they're tuning in to hear what you have to say. You're in their head speaking to them whenever they're listening to an episode. And there's responsibility that comes with that. As far as monetizing a show, I've told people a lot, when you have a smaller show or a niche show, there are options there. People, when they think monetization, they think they have to go straight for ads. Like, if I want to make money on my show, I need a Blue Apron ad on my podcast. I need Squarespace. I need ZipRecruiter and all these things, where the reality is smaller shows have a great opportunity to monetize. It's just in different ways. It's just in crowdfunding, like through Patreon. It's just in having a coaching program or a mastermind group that listeners of your show can join. There's options there. I just feel like the bigger podcasts that are out there have a lot of attention. When people see that, they think that's the only way, and there's many other avenues to get there.
So what does it take to break through, find the audience that connects with your podcast, and keep them engaged amidst growing competition?
Podcasting is successful, and people see a show that has really grown and been able to, make a living off a podcast, and they want to replicate that. And they, in the interest of growing something, they pull away from their natural instincts. And we try to make sure everybody understands the power of podcasting, like really where it comes from, and to try to keep that. And it might seem like counterproductive at first because you want to follow like a successful route or a successful method of other shows. But really what people want to hear is who you are, your personality, how you talk to these people. And they really want to feel like they connect and they know who is hosting the show that they're listening to. But with that comes, you have to understand growing a show starting at that point is going to take much longer rather than starting a podcast with a team behind you and an actual brand and an audience that's built in. So patience is the thing that it's really hard to, impress upon people that want to start a show, because they see even, like the outliers of shows that will just blow up very quickly and, they'll be successful basically from day one, it seems like. People see that and they think if they start a show, they want to kind of follow that trajectory, but it's not realistic for everybody. So just understanding that it takes time to grow an audience, it takes time to grow a fan base, to find your voice as you're hosting a show. Podcasts, that when you start one, it gets a life of its own. And I say it's like a song back when I was in the studio, like working on music, and you have to give time for that thing to grow and to figure out what it needs to be, and like leave time to understand where the podcast is going to go and be able to follow it there, instead of trying to know, from day one, it has to be like this. I have to host like this. We need these kind of guests. Like, we need patience. We need time to let these things kind of manifest.
Would you almost say a lot of this is a bit of a test and learn? So this is a common theme that comes up in many of my podcasts, and whether it's a particular topic on marketing or product development or whatever it may be, but to really find the right way or the right approach that optimizes any goal. It is about testing and learning and trying and see what works and what sticks and letting it evolve somewhat organically.
Yeah. It's like, but you get to be very quick with things on a micro level, but you have to be very patient on a macro level. Like, you need to take the time to let your podcast grow into itself. But at the same time, you put an episode out, everybody's able to hear that immediately. And if they're going to give you feedback, they're able to give you that feedback right away. But at the same time, you have to let it grow over time as you start to make those tests. Like, let's do a 5-minute episode. Let's see what that does. Let's do a 3-hour episode where we just have this long of a conversation and see how that does, and kind of A/B test things like that as you go through.
If there are 3 key things that you would tell them in terms of how to best plan a podcast so that you're setting yourself up for success in the long run, because it's a long game, what would you tell them?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. Because everybody's show is different. Everybody has a different background. Like, somebody, maybe if a blogger is starting a show, then the copywriting aspect of a podcast is very easy. So that doesn't get in their way, versus someone like me who hates writing. I don't want to do that. And that would detract me from keeping my show rolling. So, I would say whatever's going to get in your way as you're trying to put out content is outsource that. Get that off your plate, or try to minimize it altogether. Because the worst thing that can happen is that you start to really hate producing your show. Like, if you ever feel podcasting it's difficult, but it should always be fun. You should always enjoy it. And if there's ever a time where you feel like this is just really killing me trying to put this episode out, that is the signal that there's something in your workflow there that you need to either optimize or automate it or outsource it.
And Ben echoes Cody's sentiment, because to optimize the how, you have to determine what you're best at. So you never lose sight of the why, that passion that drove you to do this in the first place. And what you start out with may not be what you end up with, because you will end up pivoting and evolving your podcast to align to what feels right to you.
It's probably pretty similar to the advice that you might get if you were starting a startup, or maybe my advice would be more to treat it like starting a startup, and to be very aware of the amount of time commitment it's going to take up front, and I guess just accept that, and to also sort of identify the places where you are strong or comfortable using your time. It's like, I think it's very possible for someone to 100% DIY a podcast and not from beginning to end. But obviously it's a lot of just energy. So identify maybe the places where you're not strong and where you could use other people and let other people fill in those holes for you, whether that's as a guest or as a co-host or as an editor, or if you want to get really into it, maybe as a branding person. But it takes a consistent commitment, and probably at a certain point, you're going to have to be fairly passionate about what you are doing a podcast on, because otherwise I don't know how 50 episodes in, you're going to have just be excited enough or be able to get yourself to continue doing it if it is something that takes 8 hours of your week or whatever it is.
Right. Well, some of the things that I learned in going through this myself, you don't always exactly know how you want to shape it from the beginning. You have an idea, but all that takes time to figure out your specific angle, your flow, how much time you want your podcast to be. There's music, there's all these parameters that go into creating it end to end. And I don't know if this is true. I'll speak for myself, but certainly I wasn't aware of all the specific variables when I first did it. And so a lot of it is trial and error, and you're iterating as you go along. You're learning different formats and styles, because no one style is necessarily unique. You have to find the one that best reflects, your personality, and to some degree what you said is your strengths. I'm not sure if everybody knows that going in.
Yeah, and I would say going in, I wouldn't actually recommend someone I would never recommend someone saying I'm going to do a 30-minute show and it's always going to be 30 minutes long. And we're going to do first 5 minutes are going to be on this, second 15 minutes going to be on this, last 10 minutes going to be on this. I don't think that is going to be conducive to a great podcast generally. I think that you might develop some of those. It might end up that you generally do a certain thing and have a certain flow. But I think just actually sitting down and starting is the most important thing early on.
So if I could rephrase it almost sounds, or what I take away is that if you go in with almost too much of a prescriptive formula, that could limit you. The best thing to do is maybe you've got some guardrails, you got some parameters, but let it evolve. And you might pivot, you might adapt, but try it and see where it takes you. And then you'll over time figure out sort of the right fit and flow for you.
Yeah. There are a lot of people out there who have articles that are along the lines of the best length of a podcast is 22 minutes or whatever. And just because the most on the charts are that long, but then you look at the ones that are pretty much at the top of the charts forever are things like Hardcore History, which is released once a month and 3 hours long, or Joe Rogan's podcast, which is insanely often and also 3 hours long. And it's kind of impossible to say there is one format of a podcast that actually reigns supreme over others.
So it's interesting, the metrics or the guidelines or rules of thumb that people are putting out there on podcasts don't necessarily reflect maybe what's reality out there.
I'd say that's definitely true. There's certainly some behind the sort of metadata kind of guidelines to follow. It's to make sure Apple doesn't kick you out. But outside of that, I don't think there's any guidelines that are that strict for a podcast to be successful.
What's critically important to drive listenership momentum is consistency, not necessarily frequency. But as Cody and Ben will share, we can't forget the core basics, which is about creating good content that connects with your audience.
Yeah, frequency. What I would actually say is consistency is more important than that. But still, content is at the top of that list. Content is the number one thing. You never want to sacrifice that just to make sure an episode goes out at Monday at 6 a.m. or whatever it's going to be. But consistency is also huge. I mean, you start having people that are listening to your show, and when Monday rolls around, they're getting ready for work and they expect a new episode to be there, so that their commute is now, they have you to listen to on their commute. So that consistency is important, but never at the cost of content.
And I think many people fall into the trap of thinking frequency or reach or volume is the number one thing versus truly thinking about what the content is intended to do and ensuring that it delivers value and delivering in a consistent way. So at the end of the day, it is good content. Like that is the most important thing.
Yeah.
And subsequently, listeners, or in this case, listeners, but other positive metrics that you want, that will follow.
If you think you're going to be judged on the day of release of every episode, that's wrong. Because if somebody finds your show in 6 months, they have a catalog of 6 months worth of content to go back to. So if episode 7 is terrible content just because you wanted to get it out on time, that is detracting a listener that found you down the road but wants to hear like the rest of your back catalog of shows.
I think there's also it's more than just having good content. I think you want content that somehow forms a relationship with whatever audience you're targeting. And I think that's realistically where, if you are looking to optimize a podcast, where you can maybe find some sort of statistic or like concrete return on investment, that if you are trying to engage an audience or get them to do a thing, even if it's just keep listening to you, getting them engaged in a way that you can actually see them is probably what's going to maybe fulfill you if you are like a bit anxious about the fact that you can't necessarily see all of the data that you'd like.
Having that passion and patience and being able to adjust along the way is important to building an audience that truly connects with your story. And this intimate experience is what has drawn the members of Crate Media and many others into being avid listeners and podcast creators. So as the medium continues to gain more momentum, where does the team see the podcast space going?
It's only going up. It really is. I mean, I don't consider myself to be a mystic, to be able to see into the future. But from what I can see, it will only go up because it has everything. It has everything behind it. It has everything that you could want. You have the ability to be authentic. Let's think of YouTube, right? When it first came about, how would you describe it when it first came about? How would you describe it to your friends? Say it's 2007 again, and whenever YouTube came out, how would you describe it to your friends? Well, anyone can put up a video. What, anyone? Yes, anyone. Can you say anything you like? Well, yeah, pretty much anything you like. It has that authenticity behind it. This is what people crave. And yes, it will go. I think in the future, we will see it become a little more commercial. I mean, if you look on the UK's podcasting apps, BBC consistently rank up the top. UK is a bit more of a newer audience than the US. And you will see that. You'll see The Guardian, you'll see, CBS, you'll see things like this. You will see that. And I think that will grow. But I think that's a good thing. I think that gives credence to the idea that podcasting is a viable option. It's a medium that can be trusted. All these things. I think this is all going to happen. In fact, this all is happening with podcasting. I think it's just going to continue to rise, much in the same way as YouTube has.
And I know that you've seen more corporate entities pursue that in a way where that becomes more their content strategy. They feel that this is the way to reach their audiences in a more authentic fashion.
Absolutely. Well, firstly, you put out content where the people are. If you know that all of your friends are on Instagram, you primarily do photos, and people know that people listen to podcasts. When you get in your car and you go to work, if you do work in an office, what do? You put on podcasts. People know that people are listening to them, and I always say that wherever the corporate companies are going, they obviously know that that's where the money is, and where the money is, that's where is going to grow. This is why I see it growing. Do you know what I mean?
As podcasting moves into the mainstream with corporations ultimately employing the medium to reach their audience, Hayden sees it as a good thing. But there's always a risk from Cody's perspective that it will be used as another marketing tool and lose that authenticity, those indie roots that he spoke of earlier.
Yeah, they are. I mean, the Trader Joe's podcast came out, I think last year, maybe a year and a half ago, and that was a big one. I wouldn't say like it's necessarily one of the best shows ever, but to see like a bigger corporation like that really adopting it and, trying to stay true to what podcasting is really rooted in, think was very interesting to see, and I'm curious where other, bigger brands and companies are going to take it. The fear that I have is that it's going to be seen as just another marketing tool. And the trick is that it is another marketing tool, but it can't be treated that way.
When it comes to developing and growing your podcast, it's about defining your compelling purpose and sticking to it. To be successful, your content has to be consistent in its authenticity, never letting the pursuit of monetization take value away from your listener community. And you have to enjoy the journey. It's not a one and done. Finding your niche takes time. You're learning as you go, finding your voice, your audience, and crafting your stories. In the end, it's about going back to the basics and sticking to your roots, always remembering why you started the podcast in the first place, and delivering something meaningful to your audience. When you do that, the growth you're looking for should occur organically. Thanks for listening to the Strategic Momentum Podcast. And thanks again to my guests from Crate Media, Cody Boyce, Hayden Lee, and Ben Gregson. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, leave us a review. It's a small thing, but it can make a big difference. And I want to take the time to invite anyone listening to get in touch if you have a guest you want to hear from or a topic you want to learn more about. The Strategic Momentum Podcast is all about helping you get the tips and advice you need to propel you and your business forward in any role or industry. So if you have any thoughts for anything you want covered, I'd love to hear from you. Send your thoughts to info@flywheelassociates.com, contact us via our website, or even reaching out on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, or Instagram. To hear previous episodes or get show notes from this episode, you can visit us at flywheelassociates.com/podcast. I'm Connie Steele, and you've been listening to the Strategic Momentum Podcast.